This video is brought to you by Ground News. On Monday, China's National Bureau of Statistics released its inflation figures for May, with year-on-year consumer inflation coming in below zero for the fourth consecutive month. Falling prices might sound like good news, but persistent deflation is becoming a real issue for the Chinese economy that the CCP are struggling to fix. So in this video, we're going to look at the most recent data, what's driving this deflation, and how it might be fixed. Who is the most influential person in the world? Well, with your help, we've put together a full ranking. Learn the top 10 in the video linked below, or pick up a copy of our magazine for the full list. So let's start by looking at the data. Basically, China has two measures of inflation. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which measures inflation for ordinary Chinese households and consumers by tracking the year-on-year change in the cost of a weighted basket of goods that are commonly bought by Chinese households, and the Producer Price Index, or PPI, which measures inflation for Chinese industry by tracking the year-on-year change in the cost of certain commodities and industrial inputs, essentially the price that factories are paying for their goods. Both of these have been pretty low since really 2023, with the CPI hovering around 0% and PPI around -2%. But the most recent data for May found that CPI had come in at -0.1%, the fourth consecutive month of deflation, while PPI had come in at -3.3%, down from -2.7% in April and the lowest figure since July 2023. So what's driving this remarkably acute deflation? Well, the structural cause is weak domestic demand, which has long been a chronic issue for China's economy. As we've detailed in previous videos, the Chinese government has implemented a number of policies that effectively squeeze Chinese incomes and mean that Chinese workers are underpaid. Most obviously, the CCP deliberately undervalues the yuan, which makes Chinese exports more competitive internationally, but means that Chinese workers and households can't afford as many imports. Labor unions are also illegal in China, and China's tax system focuses on consumption taxes like VAT rather than income, which makes it surprisingly regressive. These taxes are often then used to subsidize state-owned enterprises instead of being spent on public services, which effectively means more exports for state-owned enterprises at workers' expense. All in all, this means that Chinese households and workers aren't able to consume as much as you would expect, hence why consumption accounts for such a small fraction of China's GDP. But as well as a lack of demand, there's also some evidence to suggest that China's recent deflationary pressures are coming from the other side of the ledger, i.e. too much supply, which can also put downwards pressure on prices. Under China's particularly cutthroat form of state-directed capitalism, the CCP will signal that they want to dominate some new industry, like solar panels or electric vehicles, and provincial governments will respond by racing to support nascent companies in that sector. This is one of the big reasons that Chinese companies like BYD are so efficient. They've had to survive a ruthless competition against tens, if not hundreds, of competing companies. But during this period, the Chinese market is flooded with goods from these companies, often subsidized by the relevant provincial governments. This problem has been made more acute by Trump's tariffs, which have made it harder for these companies to export their surplus to American consumers, which means the products have to be forced onto Chinese consumers, and the only way they can afford them is with massive price cuts. You can see this in the electric vehicle industry at the moment. Chinese EV manufacturers are currently caught in a dramatic price war, with companies like BYD and Xiaomi slashing their prices below profitable levels because they've essentially produced too much. Now at this point, you might be asking, why is this a bad thing? After all, who wouldn't want falling prices and super cheap EVs? At the very least, a little bit of deflation sounds better than excessive inflation, which is what the Western world has been struggling with for the past few years. But persistent deflation is usually bad news for an economy, because it can become self-perpetuating, with falling prices encouraging consumers to hold out or delay purchases in order to pay lower prices in the future, thereby reducing demand further. This is particularly problematic in a heavily indebted country, because deflation and falling prices make loans even more unaffordable. Unfortunately for the CCP, many Chinese households are indeed struggling with heavy debt burdens, largely because China's multi-decade housing boom encouraged them to take on massive mortgages, which no longer look like good value for money as property prices stagnate. The obvious risk for China here is that the economy slips into a so-called balance sheet recession, akin to what happened to Japan in the 90s, resulting in decades of stagnant growth. Essentially, this happens when households and companies take out too much debt. So when asset prices fall via deflation, individuals have to focus on paying down their debts. In other words, repairing their balance sheets. While this might make sense on an individual level, for instance, if the price of your house goes down steeply, then it makes sense to focus on paying off your mortgage to reduce your risk of bankruptcy. If everyone in the economy starts doing this at the same time, then the economy stagnates. This would explain why China's admittedly modest interest rate cuts have done little to stimulate the economy. If households and companies are focused on debt minimization instead of profit maximization, then cheaper borrowing rates won't really change anything, because they don't want to borrow more money anyway. As well as the risk of a balance sheet recession, there's also a geopolitical risk here, namely that deflation could increase China's overall trade surplus, thereby stoking further tension with its trading partners. If persistent deflation encourages Chinese households to delay purchases or to spend their limited incomes paying down their debts, this will mean Chinese households buying even fewer goods than they already are. This will mean even less domestic demand for Chinese products, which will force Chinese producers to export even more of their stuff to consumers abroad. This won't go down well with many of China's trading partners, who are already worried about Chinese overcapacity and the risk of cheap Chinese exports undercutting their domestic producers. And there's some evidence this is already happening. While Trump's tariffs have reduced China's bilateral trade surplus with the US, the most recent data suggests that its overall trade surplus is as big as ever. As a final thing, the most obvious way out of this deflationary funk would be for the CCP to just give Chinese households more purchasing power. There are lots of ways Beijing could do this. Direct transfers to households, relief for the property sector, which would make households less anxious about paying off their mortgage, or even some sort of safety net, which would allow households to spend more money because they wouldn't have to save up so much cash to insure against illness or unemployment. The CCP have made tentative moves in this direction, but it clearly hasn't been sufficient, and at this point it looks like Beijing's priority is maintaining China's industrial dominance and the world's dependence on Chinese exports, even if this requires suppressing domestic demand and even risking some sort of Japan-style recession. If you want to know more about this topic, there's plenty of other outlets reporting about it online. Unfortunately though, it's sometimes hard to tell exactly which way these outlets lean politically, making it difficult to understand exactly how your view of world events is being biased by the sources you're reading. That's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. Their website and app, developed by a former NASA engineer, allows us to pull back the curtain on media bias and have a look at exactly how each story is being covered. For instance, this story about China's ongoing deflationary crisis has been covered by more than 53 sources. We know that more than 8 of these have been reported by the left, and 3 of these have been reported by the right. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of genuinely useful features. Take their blind spots feed, for instance. This shows you the stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean left, you probably missed this story on the US suspending licenses to ship nuclear plant parts to China. Here at TLDR News, we think that Ground News is an incredibly useful tool for our current media landscape, one that's constantly trying to attract your attention and sway you towards or away from certain political viewpoints. So having a tool that helps you spot this and helps you take action really is a game changer. If you're interested in everything Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. This limited time offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.